Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. The culprit nobody suspects. If I told you that a single, seemingly harmless habit, one practiced by roughly a third of adults, most of them without realizing it, was quietly driving miserable weight gain, hormonal disruption, and rising cardiometabolic risk, what would you guess it was? Not diet, not a lack of exercise, not willpower. It is 90 minutes, that's all. 90 minutes of delayed bedtime night after night, and a study published just days ago from one of the most respected medical research institutions in the world has now measured exactly what that costs the human body. The phrase "I'll sleep when I'm dead" and why that mentally is false economy. There is a particular kind of pride, especially among high-performing professionals, in treating sleep as a most negotiable line item in the day. One more email, one more hour of work, the bedtime slips, not by a dramatic amount, just by an hour, 90 minutes. And it feels subjectively like a reasonable trade. More waking hours should mean more accomplished. The research now tells a very different story. This was not a study of extreme sleep deprivation, all-nighters, or shift work. It was modeled exactly the kind of mild chronic sleep curtailment that a large share of otherwise healthy, high-functioning adults practice as a routine, and it found that the body registers it as a real psychological cost, not a natural trade-off. Inside a randomized crossover clinical trial, researchers at Columbia University's Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons, led by Dr. Ferris Duricat and Dr. Marie-Pierre Saint-Onge, pooled data from two randomized crossover trials involving 95 adults, all aged 20 or older, all at elevated cardiometabolic risk, and critically, all of them whose habitually slept 7 or more hours a night before the study began. These were not poor sleepers to begin with. Each participant completed two 6-week phases in randomized order. Separated by a washout period in one phase, they maintained their normal, adequate sleep schedule. In the order, they delayed their bedtime by 90 minutes every night, which one's actual sleep architecture was accounted for, translated to a real reduction of roughly 78 minutes of sleep per night. Because this was a randomized crossover design, each participant serving as their own control, the researchers could isolate the effect of sleep loss itself with far greater confidence than an observational study could ever provide. Throughout both phases, wrist-worn monitors tracked sleep and activity continuously, while researchers measured body weight, waist circumference, whole body composition via MRI, and a panel of hormones involved in appetite regulation. The findings were shocking. What 78 minutes actually cost you. After 6 weeks of this modest sleep restriction, participants had gained, on average, close to 1 full pound, roughly half a kilogram. Waist circumference increased by just over half a centimeter. Whole body adiposity, measured objectively by MRI rather than self-report, rose as well. I want to pause on the size of that number because it's deliberately unimpressive. 1 pound over 6 weeks is not alarming on its own, but this study was never designed to alarm. It was designed to isolate a mechanism, and the authors were explicit about what the number means when extrapolated. Losing less than an hour and a half of sleep per night, sustained over a full year rather than 6 weeks, would be expected to produce weight gain in a range that becomes clinically meaningful. A pattern that compounded year after year across a career plausibly explains a meaningful share of the gradual weight gain so many adults experience across adulthood without ever pinpointing a cause. Why weight went up, and it isn't what you'd assume. Here is the finding I think deserves the most attention because it overturns the instinctive explanation. You might assume that extra waking hours led to more snacking or that fatigue simply reduced physical activity. The data doesn't support either explanation cleanly. Total daily energy expenditure was essentially unchanged. Moderate to vigorous physical activity, real exercise was also unchanged. What changed was subtler and more clearer. Participants spent roughly 17 additional minutes per day simply sedentary while awake, not sleeping, not exercising, just inactive. And on the hormonal side, fasting leptin, a hormone central to how the brain senses and regulates long-term energy balance, was measurably elevated during the sleep-restricted phase, while ghrelin and GLP-1, two other appetite-related hormones, barely moved at all. In other words, this was not primarily a story about eating more, it was a story about the body's energy regulation, signaling quietly shifting, and about small amount, almost invisible, increases in inactivity, accumulating into a measurable outcome. The compounding math over a year. This is where the finding stops being a curiosity and starts being genuinely useful information. We are used to thinking about health risk in terms of dramatic single events. The missed physical, the sudden diagnosis. What this research demonstrates is quieter and in some ways more consequential. A small, repeated, almost unnoticeable deficit compounding silently over months and years, producing an outcome that eventually does become clinically significant. This is precisely the same pattern I've discussed in this series with respect in inflammaging and mitochondrial decline, biological drift that never announces itself with a single symptom, only with a slow accumulation that eventually crosses threshold. Sleep in this framing is not soft wellness recommendation, sitting alongside diet and exercise. Based on this evidence, it functions as a primary level in metabolic regulation. One many high-performing professionals treat as the most dispensable when the data suggests it may be among the least dispensable of all. What the researchers actually recommend. The researchers were careful not to overstate their findings. This was a modest effect in a relatively small trial, focused on adults already at elevated cardiometabolic risk. Findings that warrant replication before being treated as universal, but their practical recommendation was direct and consistent with data. Protecting 7 or more hours of sleep per night is not a lifestyle preference to be sacrificed under time pressure. It is a measurable, quantifiable input into long-term weight and metabolic regulation, on par with the attention we already give to diet and physical activity. For anyone managing demanding schedule, the practical translation is straightforward. Treat your sleep window with the same non-negotiable status you would give an important meeting, not because sleep is virtuous, but because the evidence now shows with genuine experimental rigor exactly what its absence costs. We tend to reach for complicated explanations for slow, creeping changes in our health, a new diet trend, an undiscovered toxin, a genetic predisposition. This study is a reminder that the explanation is simple and closer to home than we would like to admit. 90 minutes traded away most nights for months and years without anyone ever declining or deciding all at once to make that trade. The evidence is now precise enough to put a number on this cost. What you do with that number is, as it was always, is the medicine, a matter of informed choice. Thank you so much.